December 16th, 1944, Aero 6:30. Monschau, Germany, a hard frost glazed the field that morning. A pencil rasped across rough paper as Hauptmann Klaus Richter tried to pin a scene to ink that his eyes refused to forget. He had watched a slaughter that made no sense by the old rules of war. Men huddled in shallow foxholes were blasted not by direct hits, but by explosions that occurred above them, bursts in the air that sprayed steel like rain. Trenches that had withstood artillery for years offered no refuge. Death came down from the sky itself. Within minutes, an entire battalion lay broken. 700 men killed or mortally wounded, most without the dramatic ruptures of direct impact, but shredded by a storm of high-velocity fragments falling from detonations 10 or 20 meters overhead. The survivors staggered back in a state that was less shock than bewilderment, mouthing the same terrified refrain, "The air kills." Richter, with soldierly bluntness, could not know the truth. He had just seen the combat debut of a compact, self-acting sensing device inside an artillery shell, a fuse that listened to the sky and chose the moment to destroy. In the months and years that followed, that small device would alter tactical doctrine, save thousands of Allied lives, and signal the first practical era of sensor-guided munitions. The idea did not spring from laboratories in the United States, but from the urgent, crowded wards of British air defense, when survival itself hung in the balance. In late 1939, as winter tightened over Exeter and the British Isles braced for a new kind of aerial war, an engineer named W.A.S. Butemont proposed an audacious concept. What if a shell could carry a radio receiver tuned to detect the presence of an aircraft and detonate automatically at the optimal distance? The arithmetic that drove the idea was brutal. During the Great War, anti-aircraft gunners had fired thousands upon thousands of shells for a single confirmed downing. With aircraft flying faster and higher, the ratio only worsened. The radio-triggered fuse promised to shrink that waste into something like efficiency. But a concept is not a combat solution. The practical problem loomed like a cliff. A shell leaves a gun under unimaginable stress, tens of thousands of times the pull of gravity, rotation so rapid they would shred normal components, temperatures and shocks that would ruin any delicate vacuum tube. British engineers built early unspun prototypes, essentially rocket-borne test beds, and proved the sensing principle against balloons and calibration targets. But they hit a wall. There was no industry in wartime Britain with the combined scale and spare capacity to solve the mechanical, electrical, and manufacturing challenges required to make the idea reliable in mass. In one of those decisions that can tilt history, Britain decided to gamble on partnership. In September 1940, a small delegation crossed the Atlantic carrying not just documents but blueprints and prototypes, radar systems, jet engine sketches, explosive chemistry, the nation's most precious technological secrets packed into locked cases. The Tizard mission, as it became known, delivered these to American scientists and officials who had the factories and raw materials Britain lacked. Among the gifts was the proximity fuse concept, and Washington's scientific establishment, primed by men like Vannevar Bush, recognized the magnitude of what was possible. America moved fast and secretly. A cluster of laboratories and university teams took responsibility for the program. Carnegie Institute researchers, university physicists, engineers from private industry, and the newly formed Applied Physics Laboratory outside Baltimore. The challenge was brutally specific. Compress a working continuous wave radar system, transmitter, receiver, amplifiers, filters, triggering electronics, into a shell nose the size of a coffee can. Make it survive firing and spin. Ensure it could be powered for the seconds of flight, and include redundant safety measures so it could not detonate in the gun barrel or close to friendly forces. It was engineering at the limits of contemporary technology. The heart of the problem was the vacuum tube. In 1940, electronic tubes were fragile glass, devices with filaments, hung on delicate leads, perfectly adequate in radios, and lab instruments but hopeless, for a device enduring thousands of gravities and a savage twist. Engineers sought inspiration in unlikely places, hearing aid manufacture, where miniaturization and rugged mechanical mounting had been explored. The breakthrough was partly mechanical, a system that rigidly supported filaments and components during the violent acceleration of firing, then allowed normal electrical contact once the shell reached stable flight. Designers proposed springs, clamps, and mechanical traps that held parts immobile only until centrifugal forces relaxed them into operating position. It was a paradox. The device had to be fragile enough to operate and robust enough to survive being thrown. Power presented another Australia-sized problem. Conventional batteries could not survive the launch or be guaranteed fresh after long storage. The solution was an elegant little invention, a reserve battery whose electrolyte was contained in a fragile ampule. During storage, it was inert. During firing, the ampule shattered, and centrifugal force drove the fluid into the active plates, activating the cell only when the shell flew. That meant long shelf life, immediate power on demand, and another layer of safety. The radio itself operated on a continuous wave or autodyne principle. The projectile's metal casing served as part of the antenna system, its nose containing a small coupling element. An oscillator produced a steady radio frequency. When the shell approached a target, reflected energy altered the oscillator's load and produced beat frequencies. Those modulations could be filtered, amplified, and used to trip a small gas-filled switching tube that initiated the detonator. Centrifugal arming switches and very short-timed arming delays prevented premature activation near friendly troops or in the gun mount area. The system was elegant in the sense that it had to be ruthlessly simple. One tube often performed both transmit and receive functions. Amplifiers were minimized, components were hardwired and ruggedized. By early 1943, the first combat uses began. In the Pacific, where air threat to ships was relentless, naval commanders were hungry for anything that would increase hit probability and reduce the enormous rounds-per-kill ratios of traditional anti-aircraft fire. On a day near Guadalcanal, the crew of USS Helena watched the new green-banded shells leave their barrels. The first salvo seemed at first like any other, arcs of dark casings against a bright sky. But as the rounds closed, they began detonating not in a trace along the target, but in the space around it, near-miss detonations that produced a spherical spray of fragments. A bomber hit by such a burst did not usually explode in cinematic fashion. It simply ceased to fly. Fuselage and wings would snap and the plane would tumble, wing and engine parts separating in a ragged, violent ballet. The psychological effect was immediate and powerful. Sailors, who had once considered anti-aircraft gunnery a lottery, found themselves knocking down multiple attackers with far fewer rounds. Tests in Chesapeake Bay against radio-controlled drones reinforced a conclusion the fleet would adopt urgently: proximity-fused ammunition transformed anti-aircraft defense. In one test, 3 drones were eliminated in rapid succession with astonishing economy. The Navy canceled remaining trials and ordered full-scale production and distribution. Statistics began to show the magnitude of the change. Though proximity rounds often accounted for a minority of fired anti-aircraft shells, they produced a disproportionately large share of the kills. Where conventional timed or contact fuses demanded many hundreds of shells to down a plane, proximity fuses reduced that number dramatically. As crews learned the new round's optimal engagement envelopes and gunnery doctrine adapted, the per-kill expenditure improved further. By mid-1944, proximity fuses were present across the fleet. In the enormous carrier and amphibious battles of the Marianas and Philippine Sea, their effect was unmistakable. Japanese formations that had once pressed home, attacks against ships now found themselves meeting a sky, punctuated by perfect little puffs of black smoke, detonations that fragmented attackers before they could reach their targets. The weight of anti-aircraft fire, augmented by the new fuses, helped blunt carrier-based strikes. Pilots either broke off or went down in spirals. The casualty disparity was stark. American losses in aircraft and ships were smaller relative to the mass of Japanese air power committed. Yet every tactical advantage invites adaptation. Japan, recognizing that aircraft destroyed mid-air could not achieve their mission, shifted to an extreme response. Pilots volunteered for suicide missions, turning their planes into living bombs. The kamikaze tactics sidestepped the logic of near-miss detonation. A plane reduced to fragments before impact could be neutralized, but one that retained enough structure to ride out an explosion might still slam into a ship by sheer momentum. Proximity fuses still destroyed many kamikaze before they struck, reduced the number that reached ships, and even degraded the effectiveness of attackers by shredding control surfaces. But the onset of mass suicide tactics drove a horrific increase in damage and casualties. The Okinawa campaign provided a brutal case study in both the fuse's potency and its limits. Radar picket ships and destroyers, often isolated in the first line of detection, fought sustained waves of attackers day after day. Proximity-fused 5-inch rounds became their primary defense. Magazines consumed at rates commanders described as unbelievable. On one radar picket station, a destroyer's crew fired with a rhythm that matched the incoming swarms. Burst. Wait for the telltale puff, relay fire. One ship, battered but resolute, reported scores of splashed attackers and some that still breached the screens and crashed into hulls. Official analyses after the campaign suggested that proximity fuses had prevented far greater losses. Without them, casualties and ships lost would likely have been multiples of the recorded toll. There were also paradoxes. The weapon that made conventional attacks suicidal made desperate, suicidal attacks comparatively more attractive. Tactical logic shifted. Commanders and planners had to reckon not only with hardware, but with human choices provoked by hardware. The proximity fuse had reduced one set of threats and, in the process, indirectly encouraged another. Beyond the battlefield numbers lay an industrial and scientific legacy. Making millions of tiny, rugged electronic devices on wartime production lines required new quality control, novel supply chains, and the rapid scaling of micro-manufacturing techniques. Companies that made hearing aids and consumer radio parts were pulled into the war effort, their processes redesigned for resilience and mass throughput. The project taught engineers how to build sensors that would survive shock and vibration, batteries that could be reliably activated on demand, and compact circuits that performed under brutal conditions. In the post-war years, those lessons would propel advances in aerospace electronics, guided munitions, and survivable instrumentation, and there were lessons about secrecy. The fuses were guarded jealously. Early shipments moved under strict controls. Crews were often told the ammunition was special incendiary to limit knowledge of the true mechanism. The insistence on secrecy paid strategic dividends. The technology reached battlefields before adversaries could analyze and reproduce countermeasures, giving Allied forces a crucial operational window. On quiet mornings years later, historians would trace the fuse's contribution to victory in analytic appendices and operational studies. They would measure reductions in rounds per kill, estimate lives and ships saved, and note the ripple effects on tactics and doctrine. But those dry calculations could not capture the first raw astonishment, the sight of an aircraft that had been a threat seconds before, trailing fire and falling apart like a living thing, suddenly cut to pieces by invisible science. Sailors and gunners remembered the feeling, a sudden sliver of potency in the chaos of battle, an instrument of defense that felt at times almost providential. Back in Monschau, Hauptmann Richter's notation in his field diary would remain a simple, terrible fragment of testimony. Men dead where no direct hits could explain it. Survivors muttering about an air that kills. For the Americans and British whose months and years of research, sleepless nights and factory floors had produced the small miracle inside the shell, it was proof that thoughtful design and industrial will could change the calculus of war. The proximity fuse did not end the conflict alone, but it made outcomes more survivable, shifted tactical balances, and inaugurated a new age in which munitions could sense, decide, and act. A first practical step toward the smart weapons that would later redefine battlefields. The tiny canisters of metal and glass, fired in the tens of millions, left a mark that outlived the war. They reshaped how militaries valued sensors and rugged electronics, taught industries how to scale fragile technologies, and etched into memory the lesson that in modern war, the combination of science and production capacity could be as lethal as any formation of men. and on cold mornings in foxholes and on ship bridges, soldiers and sailors understood in a visceral way what engineers had proved at the bench. Technology can tilt the balance of survival. The air, Richter wrote in the frost, had become a weapon, and the fuse had made it so.